Unfortunately, the religion of Islam is feared by many people in the United States or the Western world. Unfortunately, a very small minority of people professing to follow the teachings of Muhammad have engaged in some terrible actions that have caused many Americans to paint all Muslims with a broad brush as latent terrorists. Though it is interesting to note, I find it very interesting to note, that we do not paint all Christians with the same broad brush of being terrorists for the actions of the Ku Klux Klan, or for men like Eric Rudolph, who identified himself as part of the Christian identity movement, who set the bomb off in the Centennial Olympics Park in Atlanta, and then went on to bomb an abortion clinic and a lesbian nightclub before he was finally arrested. Obviously, Christian terrorism. Now, it may be possible that we in the West have a concern, have some fear about Islam, because most of the adherents of Islam are people of color, and we in the West do not know much about this religious tradition. Now, I admit that I also don't know much about Islam. I've done some reading on it. I've listened to some imams talk about their faith. I had an imam come to my prior church to give the service to help educate me, help educate the congregation, but I still don't know much about the faith. So when I realized that Ramadan started on a Sunday that I would be preaching, I decided to do some research about this one small aspect of the religion that has 1.8 billion adherents, making up about 24% of the world population. And I discovered as I'm doing the research, Islam, as with all great religions, has potential spiritual lessons for everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims. So I wanted to think about what Islam, the major religious observance, Ramadan, this major religious observance of Islam, might teach us. But first, a little bit of background about Ramadan that I've gathered from my research and reading. And again, I emphasize, this is what books and articles have told me, not from personal experience. This evening, assuming the clouds separate, with the sighting of the crescent moon, Muslims will begin observance of the holy month of Ramadan, which is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. And because the Islamic calendar is based on the movement of the moon, it moves through the Gregorian solar calendar. So this year it happens to be in May. Last year it was in March, I think, and then one time I saw it was in December. Ramadan is considered to be the holiest time of the year because it is said that this is the month in 610, following the Gregorian calendar, of the Common Era, in which God, through the angel Gabriel, delivered the first set of teachings to Muhammad that would later become the Quran. It's interesting, Islamic scholars have calculated this event to have happened on Monday night on the 21st of Ramadan. The rest of the revelations that would be incorporated by scholars over a few years, actually 20 years is about all it took, we incorporated into the Quran, were delivered over the next 23 years to Muhammad, the last revelation coming just before he died. Now, it's probably known by everyone that the most significant aspect of Ramadan is that all healthy, older Muslim children and adults, with some exceptions, are to fast from sunup to sundown during the 29 or 30 days of this month. Fast is broken at sundown with a large, often celebratory meal that is called iftar. By tradition, dates are the first food that is eaten to commemorate Muhammad's breaking his fast with dates. You'll find some dates on the table in the fellowship hall today, if I don't get there first. And the month of Ramadan is concluded with 1 to 3 day celebration that includes special services at the mosque, or sometimes out in an open field or a neighborhood area with a very special meal, often celebrated in community. Now, fasting in the month of Ramadan is one of the 5 foundational pillars of Islam. The other 4 pillars are shahada, which means bearing witness to the unity of God, Allah. Salat, it's engaging in ritual prayer 5 times a day. There is a story told that at some point Muhammad went up to heaven, and as Muhammad was walking around heaven, bumped into Moses. And Moses asked Muhammad what he was thinking about for way of honoring God. And he said he was thinking about prayer, and he thought that 50 times a day was going to be appropriate. And Moses said, I don't think that will work. So they went back and forth, talking about what the day should be. Muhammad kept lowering it down. Well, maybe it should be 30. Well, maybe it could be 15. And they finally decided that 5 times a day would be adequately pious for God. The third pillar of Islam is zakat, which is paying an alms tax to the poor, normally done at the very end of Ramadan. The alms tax is set at 2.5%. I love this. Let me see. Our stewardship committee is here, and everyone else listen to this. It's 2.5% of a person's gold, silver, cash, savings, investments, rental income, business merchandise, and profit and security, excluding. Oh, I love that. Excluding money needed for direct living expenses, and something that I'm calling a hold harmless clause, that allows a person to keep an equivalent of 3 ounces of gold, which in this year was calculated to be $3,849. Then the last pillar is undertaking the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, for this at least once in a life, if possible. I looked it up. You can get to Mecca for this time of the year for about $6,900, all inclusive. Though fasting is a central element of Ramadan, there are other religious practices that are done during the month, such as reading all 114 chapters of the Quran and attending special prayer services every day if possible. Now, some religious scholars suggest that the concept of rigorous fasting in Islam had its origins actually in strict Lenten discipline of the Assyrian Church of the East, that was located throughout the Middle East, the Christian church located throughout the Middle East in the time of Muhammad. And as well as actually the practices of some of the pagan faiths right around Mecca that also fasted to atone for their sins, and also it's interesting to try to ward off any drought. Fasting during Ramadan not only means the abstinence from food, but also refraining from sex and all vices and evils such as violence and anger, envy, greed, lust, lying, sarcastic remarks, and gossip. Maybe the Pope was thinking about Ramadan when he told the hairstylist not to gossip. Islamic teachers say that there are actually 4 main purposes for this fasting. First, it is a way to develop and strengthen our powers of self-control so that we can resist wrongful desires and bad habits, and therefore guard against evil. By fasting and refraining from the natural human urges to satisfy one appetite, Muslims are showing that they can exercise self-restraint so they can then apply it to their everyday life. Second, according to Islamic religious leaders, fasting enables a believer to attain nearness or closeness to God so that God actually becomes a reality in their lives. It is believed that a Muslim bears the rigors of fasting purely for the sake of following this divine commandment, is conscious that God is present and God enters their heart, resulting in a higher spiritual experience. Mizra teacher Ghulam Ahmed, a prolific writer about Islamic teachings and the founder of a sect of Islam in India in the mid-19th century, prepared a commentary on Ramadan for his followers in which he said, "People are unaware of the true nature of fasting. Fasting is not just a state of remaining hungry and thirsty. Its nature and effect can only be discovered by experience. Human makeup is such that the less food that is consumed, the greater is the purification of the soul and the development of the powers of inner vision. The object of fasting is that a person should abstain from food which nourishes the body to obtain other food which nourishes and brings solace to the soul." The third explanation and reason for fasting is that Muslims are learning through fasting to refrain from usurping other people's rights or their belongings. Through Ramadan fasting, where people voluntarily give up even what is rightfully theirs, they can come to better understand that it is wrong to even think about, this is envy, thinking about envy or coveting your neighbor's belongings, that it is wrong to even hold those kinds of beliefs. And fourth, believers learn to give and to not take through the deprivation of Ramadan. Religious leaders teach that this holy fasting is a lesson for Muslims to have sympathy with the suffering of others and then heighten their desire to alleviate it. Muslims are to remember and to use their hunger to remember the blessings in their life, which they normally take for granted, and then learn to practice charity and kindness and generosity to help other people in the world. So it is through this earthly action, Muslims have an opportunity to obtain greater God consciousness and then have an awareness to gain the discipline and self-restraint and have a greater incentive to do good and avoid wrong. It's sometimes said that for Muslims to observe Ramadan is sort of like pushing a restart button for their soul. So what can this Islamic religious practice give to we non-Muslims? As I understand Ramadan, there are two underlying lessons for us. The first lesson is that people get so wrapped up in routines of dealing with everyday life or having to deal with our personal problems that we forget to think about how we treat other people and the needs of other people, especially those less fortunate than us. And second, it is important that people engage in some kind of action that gets them, in UU terminology, to be more connected to that transcending mystery and wonder which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. We find that in our sources section of our Statement of Purposes and Principles. Actually, so in simpler terms, it says it's important for people to have a spiritual dimension to existence and need to do something to enhance our spiritual dimensions. Now, we do not need to observe Ramadan to do either of these actions, but it can be a guide for us. Its message can guide us and perhaps remind us that we need to set aside time to reconnect to our spiritual side and to reflect on how we are living our lives, how we are living in relationship to other people. So Ramadan does this for Muslims. Lent does this for Christians. The high holy days do this for Jews. But we Unitarian Universalists, however, do not have such an observance dictated to us. This means that, like so much else in our religious practice, we need to find our own path to spiritual renewal. So perhaps following the inspiration of the teachings of Islam about the purpose of Ramadan, we could think about taking some time, a few hours, a few days, the whole month of May, to have our own private Ramadan, to intentionally reflect, to meditate, to pray, to engage in some kind of practice, perhaps even reading some inspirational works that will get us closer to our spirit, and then open our hearts, open our minds to doing what is right and just for our lives and for the lives of others. So be it.